Hey guys, buckle up, because tonight we're diving headfirst into a quirky corner of medieval life. The bizarre ways people actually entertain themselves. Now, before you get any modern ideas, remember, no phones, no streaming services, and absolutely no escape rooms. So what did they do? Well, picture pig races, cheese wrestling competitions, and farting contests considered a legitimate source of amusement. It was a world where utter boredom collided with unbridled creativity in the most delightfully strange ways. Before we get too far in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying this little journey into quiet storytelling. And drop a comment to let me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting knowing who else is out there, drifting off into the past with us. Now settle in. Let the day's worries fade away as we journey back together to those forgotten corners of history. The sun crawled languidly over the hills, like a yolk oozing from a broken egg, painting the damp rooftops of a village so ancient it had forgotten its own name. Smoke lazily spiraled from crooked chimneys, without a care in the world, and the mud in the streets squelched with a sound that made you question your life choices if your bare foot had the misfortune of landing in it. And somewhere, off in the distance, the rooster remained stubbornly silent. He was awake. All right, he just couldn't muster the enthusiasm. Maybe he had a touch of laryngitis, or was wrestling with an existential crisis. Or perhaps, after watching the same villagers trip over the same bucket every morning for the past 3 years, he'd decided to stage a full-blown boycott. Whatever the reason, the silence was noticeable, which only amplified the sound of the baker's boy tumbling off his stool. There was a rare moment of laughter, dry, dusty, the kind that didn't shake shoulders, but rustled shawls. They rarely admitted it, but there was a strange kind of affection buried beneath the layers of judgment and oat crumbs. A kind of sisterhood formed not by love, but by repetition, survival, and the shared understanding that everyone eventually gave them something to talk about. They moved on to pigs next. The big one near the churchyard had gotten loose again and eaten half a salter before someone chased it off with a broom. They debated whether that made the pig holy or blasphemous. Elizabeth suggested it was both, and that some men in the village weren't so different. More oat cakes were passed around, some dipped in tea, others simply gnawed on for something to do. No one asked for recipes. They were all made with the same 3 ingredients anyway: oats, heat, and mild resentment. By the time the sun was high enough to warm the edge of the bench, the women had covered everything from who was limping too suddenly to who was smiling too often. They weren't always right. They weren't always fair. But they were always unfailingly watching. And tomorrow they'd be back. Same time, same well, same oatcakes, and someone new to talk about. Inside the manor, where the walls leaned ever so slightly as if they'd grown tired of holding secrets, a young scribe sat hunched over a wooden desk far too noble for his level of talent. His name was Lionel, though some in the manor had taken to calling him Blot. Not out of affection, but because he'd once spilled an entire inkwell into the bishop's sleeve, and no one had ever truly moved on from it. At this moment, Lionel was in his 5th hour of copying a legal charter so dull it could probably end wars just by being read aloud. It was written in Latin, a language that, in Lionel's case, triggered a very specific response. Sneezing. Not metaphorically, actually sneezing. Out in the pasture, 3 boys squabbled over the last spoonful of stew in a wooden bowl. The stew was gray, suspiciously, unsettlingly gray. No one could quite recall what had gone into it, though one boy swore he detected a hint of turnip, another insisted it was beetroot, and the third simply muttered, "Bones," and refused to elaborate further. They decided the only fair way to settle the matter was a race to the nearest tree and back. The winner choked down the last of the mystery stew while the others watched with a mixture of envy and profound concern. By the well, an old woman carefully unwrapped a cloth, revealing a hunk of cheese so aged it had developed a distinct personality. It smelled of foot and stubborn defiance. She sliced off a piece with a knife that had seen better centuries, popped it into her mouth, and declared it tangy, which was, to put it mildly, a generous assessment. A hopeful dog sat nearby, its tail giving a tentative thump against the ground. She offered it a crumb. The dog sniffed it with great suspicion, then promptly wandered off. A small girl with dirt smudged on her chin and daisies woven into her hair plucked a radish from someone else's garden. She glanced furtively in both directions, then bit it in half. It was peppery, sharp, and deliciously forbidden. She wiped her mouth on her sleeve, stashed the other half in her pocket for later, and skipped away like a hardened criminal with absolutely no regrets. The tavern naturally offered food if you could afford it, which most couldn't. However, the tavern keeper's son had a soft spot for sob stories and wide, pleading eyes. He surreptitiously slipped 2 boiled eggs and a piece of stale pie to a passing widow who claimed she hadn't eaten since Tuesday. It was Thursday. She offered him a wink as she walked away. Some meals were born of sheer creativity. A boy named Lyle carried a squirrel that he swore he'd found. Already like that. And then there were the spoons. Brother Cuthbert carved spoons with a skill that bordered on unsettling. No one had taught him. One day he picked up a crooked twig, muttered something about a hidden shape, and by sunset had fashioned a ladle so elegant the abbot refused to use it, fearing spiritual offense. Each spoon was unique. Some had handles shaped like spirals, others like bird beaks. One had the faint face of a woman etched into its bowl, a face that evoked a sense of obligation and apology in anyone who gazed upon it for too long. The kitchen housed dozens, yet the cook insisted on using only one. The rest were for display or possibly defense, depending on her mood. No one truly knew Cuthbert's origins. He arrived one misty morning with a satchel of moss, 3 acorns, and a carved badger he claimed could smell sin. The abbot, having once spent 6 hours chasing a goose through the cloister, felt he lacked the authority to turn anyone away and welcomed him. Since then, Cuthbert had become both a curiosity and a legend. Novices whispered that he once healed a pigeon with his breath alone. Others claimed he'd been struck by lightning twice and thanked the sky both times. A few insisted he kept a journal written entirely in bird footprints. When questioned, he only smiled and said, "Some truths are feathered." The villagers regarded him with a mixture of reverence and alarm. Children left him offerings of dandelions and buttons. Old women crossed themselves when he passed, but discreetly requested talismans just in case. Young men dared each other to ask him questions like, "What do you dream about?" and then fled when he actually answered. "Mostly echoes," he once said. "Sometimes jam." One day, the abbot attempted to assign him a formal duty: script copying. Cuthbert agreed and promptly filled a parchment with drawings of frogs wearing various hats. When asked what gospel this represented, he replied, "Mark, probably." Then came the first proposal. It wasn't dramatic, just a boy kneeling in a puddle, offering a bent ring with a shaky voice. "I know I've got nothing, but maybe we could have nothing together?" The girl blinked, said nothing, then kissed him hard enough to startle a nearby owl. He forgot how to stand. She forgot how to breathe. Not far off, someone else tried the same but fumbled miserably. "Will you? Do you want to? If I built a hut?" She stared at him. "That's your pitch." He wilted. "There'd be goats. I'm allergic to goats." The moon did not blink. It merely listened. Under its watchful gaze, a dozen almost lovers stumbled through half-confessions, whispered dreams, and impulsive handholds. Someone sang again, louder this time. Someone sobbed beside a log. Another person offered a bracelet made of twine and regret. At least 2 proposals were accepted. One was sealed with a promise not to be as annoying next year. The other was sealed with a pinky swear and a spit handshake. But not everyone left glowing. Lena waited an hour under the hawthorn tree, clutching a note in her sleeve. He never came. She burned the note with a flint and walked home barefoot, wiping her eyes as if they were merely adjusting to the moonlight. Gareth proposed to the wrong girl by mistake. In the dark, cloaks looked awfully similar. She laughed until she cried. He cried until he laughed. They both agreed to pretend it never happened. 2 boys stood side by side in silence for 20 minutes. One eventually said, "Well, good night." The other nodded. Both stayed 5 more minutes just in case. The priest's daughter, who wasn't supposed to be there at all, kissed someone behind the old millstone and immediately whispered, "I think I've made a terrible mistake." He replied, "I think I've made a great one." The goat was there, too, somehow wearing a garland, possibly betrothed. The night deepened. The stars, distant and unimpressed, blinked down upon the scene. The moon crept across the sky, its pale light peering through the thin windows, illuminating crooked noses, open mouths, tattered quilts, and dangling feet. Outside, the wind whispered its own lullaby through the trees, a mournful song. A barn door creaked in the silence. A frog chirped once, then thought better of it and retreated into the quiet stillness. And in the village, sleep held most inhabitants in its embrace, not tenderly, not gently, but effectively. Despite the snores and farts, the scratching and muttering, the vivid dreams and persistent itches, the people slept, for this was life. Loud, itchy, slightly embarrassing, and knowing that tomorrow would arrive soon enough, bringing with it roosters crowing, burnt porridge, and someone pretending they hadn't confessed their love for a goat in their sleep. But for now, the village breathed, huffed, snored, and shuffled under the patchy quilt of night. And in the darkness, a single flea paused, wiped its minuscule face, and resumed its tireless work. The fires had died down in most homes now. Only a faint wisp of smoke trailed from a few chimneys, curling up into the star-choked sky like a final sigh. The village had quieted, not silenced, never that, but hushed, as if the earth itself had pulled up a woolen blanket and settled in for the night. But there was always one last task. Tomlin pulled on his boots by feel, not by sight. They were still damp from the stream, and a stray piece of straw had lodged itself inside, but he didn't complain. He was used to it. He lifted the lantern with a grunt, its light dim but warm, and stepped out into the cool embrace of the night air. His wife mumbled something from the bed, probably, "Don't forget the latch," or maybe just a plea for turnip soup, but he nodded anyway, acknowledging her unseen presence. A resounding thud, followed by a string of expletives he'd vehemently deny uttering in front of his mother, echoed through the bakery as he nursed his head and unjustly blamed the oven for simply existing. The bakery was still radiating warmth from yesterday's coals, and the air hung heavy with the scent of sleep, flour, and someone's long-forgotten sock. A lump of dough sat defiantly on the counter, refusing to rise out of sheer spite, while the baker, an old man with arms like tree trunks and a temper like a brewing storm, snored thunderously behind mountains of rye sacks. Outside, the village was stretching awake, creaking one joint at a time. A dog scratched an ear against the side of a rickety cart. A pig let out a resounding sneeze. A cow named Gertrude, still half asleep, wandered nose first into someone's laundry. No one seemed to notice, or if they did, they'd decided it was best to mind their own business. Two elderly women, cloaked in shawls and steeped in opinions, sat perched on a bench near the well. One had already declared the sun was far too bright and undoubtedly a harbinger of misfortune. The other was convinced that the rooster's missing crow meant someone had died, was about to die, or had simply forgotten to properly wind the sun that morning. She wasn't quite clear on the theological implications, but she was certain goats were somehow involved. A boy with a wild mop of hair and a tunic several sizes too large tiptoed past the church, clutching a bucket containing a single, rather judgmental-looking fish. The boy himself wore a guilty expression. He was supposed to deliver it to the reeve, but he was seriously contemplating devouring it himself, scales and all. He passed the tavern just as a bleary-eyed man stumbled out, sporting a single boot, a chicken tucked securely under his arm, and a daisy jauntily tucked behind one ear. The chicken looked decidedly concerned. Something about the parchment, or the ink, or maybe the overwhelming scent of obligation set his sinuses ablaze. He dipped the quill. It dripped. He wiped the excess on a cloth that had once been white and now looked like it had survived 3 plagues and a minor exorcism. With the solemnity of a monk, he began the next line, a universis presentibus. ***. The sneeze erupted mid-sentence, splattering a constellation of ink across the parchment. His nose now bore the mark of a man who'd fought and lost a duel with a squid. "Oh, for heaven's sake," he muttered, blotting the page so aggressively the ink spread like gossip, The steward poked his head in. Progress. Lionel smiled like a man on the edge. By all appearances. Good. That charter must be perfect. His lordship is having it read aloud at supper tonight. And with that, he disappeared before Lionel could object. Read aloud? To people? To the bishop, the magistrate, and 3 nobles who understood less Latin than he did. That was the thing. No one would understand it. Not the bishop, who mostly nodded at things and blessed whatever was closest. Not the magistrate, who once mistook a recipe for a legal summons. And certainly not Lord Redgrave himself, who had insisted the document include a clause about goose ownership rights. Just in case. Lionel sighed and began again. Somewhere in the hallway, a maid dropped a tray. The crash startled him into flicking his quill like a wand, launching a stripe of ink across the floor and onto a cat that had been napping far too peacefully under his stool. The cat woke up with a howl, launched itself onto the desk, and streaked across the page, leaving paw prints like small declarations of war. Lionel froze. The cat froze. Both considered the consequences. "I didn't see anything," he whispered to it. The cat blinked, unimpressed, and left the room with the air of someone who had just ended a toxic relationship. His plan to roast it over a fire was swiftly thwarted by his mother, who confiscated the unfortunate creature and buried it under the herb patch, muttering something about curses. Lyle made do with a clump of sorrel and an apple that he dropped, not once but twice. Near the church steps, 2 girls took turns licking honey from a twig. They'd discovered it near the beekeeper's fence and claimed it had just fallen off. It hadn't, of course, but they were quick, and the beekeeper was old. And so the honey now belonged to fate. They giggled between licks, surreptitiously dipping their fingers into the jar they hadn't stolen, merely adopted. An apprentice blacksmith, covered in soot and radiating pride, munched on a roasted onion like it was a prize. No bread, no salt, just onion. His breath cleared a 6-foot radius around him, and he seemed to relish it. He called it warrior seasoning. Out by the edge of the woods, an old man cooked something in a pot over a low fire. No one knew what it was. He never spoke of it. Sometimes he whistled while stirring. Sometimes he simply stared into the pot as if it were whispering ancient secrets. Once, someone had peeked inside and claimed to have seen a bird's foot and what might have been a pear. No one asked twice. Not all meals were scavenged from the ground, stolen, or of questionable origin. In one cottage, a mother lovingly handed out slices of oat cake and boiled carrots, calling each child by name as if they were honored guests at a royal banquet. The food wasn't lavish, but the children beamed like royalty. One boy even bowed deeply before taking a bite of his carrot. She curtsied in return. By the height of midday, the air was filled with the sounds of chewing, slurping, spitting, and one faint but persistent argument over who had licked which side of the cheese first. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't clean. But it was lunch. A traveler on the road paused to eat a handful of roasted barley from a pouch on his belt. Having exhausted their options, they moved him to gardening. He planted in spirals. The cabbage sprouted in a circle that seemed to repel snails. The lettuce grew in the shape of a fish, inadvertently honoring an obscure saint. No one argued. The produce was excellent. And yet, for all his oddities, Cuthbert was beloved. He never missed morning prayers, even if he arrived wearing a crown of thistles or dripping wet from some silent encounter with the stream. He listened better than anyone. When Brother Alwyn's mother died, Cuthbert sat with him all night, saying nothing, just whittling a spoon shaped like a weeping willow. He once scared off a bandit with a long stare and a handful of dried mushrooms. The bandit returned a week later to return a borrowed staff and ask if Cuthbert could bless his goat. The spoon carver obliged solemnly, employing 3 owl feathers and a chant that may or may not have been improvised. The goat was never the same, in a good way. At meals, he rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always something unexpected. "The moon is a borrowed tooth," he said once mid-pottage. No one questioned his meaning. They simply nodded. Felt true. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he could be seen dancing barefoot behind the chapel. Slowly, gracefully, arms outstretched as if listening to a hymn only the earth could sing. No one stopped him. In fact, a few of the younger monks began joining him, albeit clumsily and always in silence. Was he mad? Maybe. Was he wise? Possibly more than any of them. But most agreed he was something else entirely. A question the monastery had been lucky enough to receive without needing an answer. So he whittled, he wandered, he whispered to the trees, and the trees, if you listened closely, if you really listened, sometimes whispered back. Down by the river, where the reeds swayed like nosy old men and the water flowed slowly enough to hear secrets, the women gathered with baskets of laundry and mouths already ajar. By the time the stars began to fade and the horizon hinted at gray, the meadow looked like the aftermath of a very emotional harvest. Bits of ribbon, forgotten shoes, a crushed flower crown, the kind of mess you only get when too many hearts are left slightly open. One couple walked home in silence, fingers brushing occasionally, not quite ready to hold hands but too hopeful not to try again tomorrow. One boy ran, just ran, for no reason except that he'd said something stupid, and the only way to outpace shame was with his feet. And somewhere alone beneath the tree Marigold still stood. Tom had never come. She waited until the sky turned pale, then dropped the posy, turned around, and walked home with a dignity that cracked only once when she tripped on a root. By morning, no one would speak of it, not directly, but glances would linger. Smiles would mean more, and two people would avoid each other until next week when the awkwardness wore off or blossomed into something worse. Midnight had been kind to some, cruel to others, but it had been honest. And in the year of our Lord, honesty under the moon was as close to magic as most villagers ever got. Evening vespers had just begun, and the chapel smelled of wax and wet wool. The priest had cleared his throat precisely twice, the exact number needed to signal divine readiness, and the villagers had settled into their usual formation. Solemn, mildly damp, and trying not to sneeze. Candles flickered as if they, too, were struggling to stay awake. Rain tapped gently on the chapel roof, and the choir boys were humming the pre-hymn hum, which was not official but had become a tradition in the way that all things done repeatedly tend to become sacred. Then came the chicken. It entered like a ghost, with no fanfare and no apology, slipping through the open side door, left ajar by a latecomer named Ellis, who would later deny everything. First, no one noticed. Out in the yard, the ground was soft and yielding, still retaining the day's warmth in its depths. He made his way past the lean-to, past the rain barrel, past the stubborn patch of weeds that had stubbornly resisted 3 seasons of insults. The barn loomed ahead, more shadow than structure now, its roof sagging slightly like an old man bowing to the moon. He pushed the door open with a creak that seemed louder than it should have been, as if the wood itself was complaining about being disturbed so late. Inside, the barn was alive in the way nighttime barns always are. A soft rustle here, a gentle snort there, straw shifting as if it held secrets within its golden stalks. The familiar smell hit him, a comforting blend of hay, manure, damp wood, and the unexplainable scent that only animals seem to possess. "All right?" Tomlin whispered, his voice barely audible. Just one last look. He walked past the chickens first. Most were huddled together in feathered clumps, dreaming of worms and dominance. One lifted its head, blinked at him with reptilian judgment, and tucked itself back into its slumber. The goat pen came next. The twins, Mumble and Crick, were tangled together in a way that defied logic and physics. One of them chewed something in its sleep. Tomlin didn't inquire as to what. Then came the main event, Gertrude. She was the largest animal in the village, possibly the oldest, and definitely the loudest. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about expressing them. If the world wasn't to her liking, she'd let you know with a well-aimed kick, a thunderous bellow, or a long, pointed stare that seemed to pass judgment on your entire lineage. But tonight, Gertrude was uncharacteristically quiet. She lay curled in the straw like a great, hairy boulder. Her breathing was slow and steady. Her half-lidded eyes tracked Tomlin's approach with the weary tolerance of someone who had lived too long to be surprised by anything anymore. He knelt beside her. Meanwhile, the rooster, whose name no one remembered, because no one had bothered to give him one, stretched a wing, ruffled his feathers, and surveyed the village from his perch atop the blacksmith's shed. He watched the baker's boy burn his finger. He watched a child plop into a puddle and refuse to get up, convinced that if he waited long enough, someone would bring him a plum. The blacksmith's forge began to hiss to life. The hammering would soon commence, bringing with it the daily symphony of irritation, but not just yet. For now, the village was suspended in that in-between moment, too late for night, too early to be truly awake. A liminal space filled with yawns, scratched heads, and forgotten chores. The cows were confused. The chickens were muttering amongst themselves. A goat chewed thoughtfully on a boot, making direct eye contact with someone's grandmother. She didn't even blink. Then came the cart. Its wheels squealed in protest, pulled by a donkey that looked like it had seen far too much of the world. The driver, an old man with 3 teeth and a ridiculously contagious laugh, bellowed, "Good morning," like it was a battle cry. No one responded, not out of rudeness, but because most of them hadn't had their first mead or mushroom tea yet, and were deeply suspicious of such unrestrained enthusiasm. Finally, with a grunt and a flap of wings, the rooster let out a sound best described as a sneeze trapped inside a yawn, followed by a suspicious silence and a deeply embarrassed shuffle on the roof tiles. A woman hanging laundry looked up and muttered, "About time," before snapping her sheet so hard it could have doubled as a flag. And just like that, the village surrendered to the day. Boots were pulled on, aprons tied, bread shoved into ovens, and children were yelled at to stop licking fence posts. Somewhere a bell rang. Nobody knew why, but everyone assumed it meant something. The blacksmith began to curse rhythmically. He stared at the ruined page, then at the previous 4, all of them smudged, blotted, or mysteriously sticky. One had a dead fly pressed between 2 lines like punctuation. Another had a faint circle where he'd once set his tea without thinking. It wasn't that Lionel was bad at his job. He was just employed in a job that did not particularly care for him. He liked poetry. He liked stories. He once tried to sneak a haiku into a land deed just to see if anyone would notice. They hadn't. But now, every time the town crier announced that parcel's boundaries, he accidentally recited a meditation on wind and wheat. Still, this charter had to be serious. Apparently, it concerned land use, taxation, and some clause about cows that sounded vaguely threatening. So Lionel tried again. He sat straighter. He wiped the ink from his nose. He dipped carefully. He breathed through his mouth as if that might somehow stop the sneezes. And he wrote, "A universis presentibus." "Bless you," came a voice from the hallway, preemptively. He didn't sneeze that time, but he did spill tea on his foot. Midway through the paragraph about grain levies, he began to wonder if anyone in the manor actually read anything. The steward only glanced at margins. The lord looked for his name and any mention of ducks. The bishop pretended to squint as if he'd left his glasses in heaven. Maybe Lionel thought this wasn't about understanding. Maybe it was about performance, authority in long sentences, power in curled letters, and unnecessarily large wax seals. He paused and wrote a new line, "Quibustum terminus umbratis porcus reitentium," which meant, very roughly, in certain shaded circumstances, the pig rules the silence. He stared at it, smiled, then reluctantly crossed it out, mostly. By late afternoon, his desk was surrounded by a graveyard of crumpled parchment, a half-eaten oat biscuit, and a mouse that may have been reading over his shoulder. His nose was inked again, tasted of burnt earth, but he didn't complain. Another traveler gnawed on a stale heel of bread he'd been saving since the last village. He offered a bite to his mule, who wisely declined. The children, who had nothing tangible to eat, played a game with a walnut shell and 2 pebbles, pretending it was a feast. One of them mimed drinking soup with great gusto. Another declared that her rock was far too spicy. They all agreed it was the best lunch they'd never had. Eventually, bellies quieted, crumbs settled in corners, lips were wiped, and teeth were picked. And across the village, people returned to their tasks with the slow, contented satisfaction of mere survival. Because in the end, it didn't truly matter what it was or where it came from. If you could catch it, chew it, or bluff your way through eating it, then it was lunch. And in this village, on this day, that was enough. The shoemaker's cottage stood askew near the edge of the village square, a squat little place with one shutter permanently off-kilter and a front step that creaked in noisy protest whenever anyone dared to tread upon it. Especially the shoemaker himself, who was renowned for possessing the heaviest, slowest footsteps in the entire village. Some claimed it was a deliberate affectation, others blamed the shoes, and still others attributed it to the sheer weight of a man carrying years of quiet rebellion in his very arches. Inside, the air hung thick with the mingled scents of leather, dust, and long-held secrets. Sunlight streamed through a cracked window, illuminating motes of dust that danced lazily above a cluttered workbench, littered with scraps of leather, tangled thread, and half-finished boots. It was a space dedicated to industry, to craftsmanship, a place where whispered snores, if you listened closely, hinted at a presence that didn't quite belong to a diligent artisan. Laundry day was never really about laundry. It was about the rhythm of scrubbing and speaking, about pounding stains out of tunics while casually dismantling reputations. The soap, made of ash and lard, was rough as sand and just as unforgiving. Clothes got clean, sure, but what truly sparkled was the conversation. The older women arrived first, wrinkled hands, sharp eyes, tongues oiled and ready. They laid out their linens like battle plans, rolled up their sleeves, and set to work with the precision of executioners. Each slap of a wet garment against the stones served as punctuation. "Did you hear what Maeve's boy did with that hedge girl?" one of them asked, tossing a shirt down with dramatic flair. "No," said another, lathering a sock that had clearly witnessed some things. "But I hope you're about to tell me." And so the tale began. Half true, half invented, entirely delicious. Younger women trickled in next, laughing, yawning, clutching damp bundles. They greeted their elders with respectful nods and took their places along the shore, feigning modesty. But their ears were wide open, their hands scrubbing absent-mindedly, their minds already weaving together the threads of last week's gossip with today's revelations. Somewhere down the line, a girl named Brenna dropped a tunic into the river. She shrieked and ran after it, splashing wildly, only to be met with cheers and applause from the others. When she returned, dripping and defeated, an older woman handed her a cloth and said, "That tunic floated better than your chances with the butcher's son." Laughter erupted. It wasn't all cruelty, though. There was warmth in the teasing, a rough kind of affection veiled in sarcasm. They pecked at each other like birds, but if anyone else tried it, they'd defend each other with fists and bars of soap. Midway down the bank, two sisters, Ida and Ro, worked side by side, nudging each other as they scrubbed. Ida was quiet, which made her a favorite target. The chicken moved with the kind of stealth usually reserved for sinners and tax collectors. It was a modest chicken, brown-feathered, beady-eyed, possibly sentient. It strutted halfway down the aisle before anyone made a sound. It was the blacksmith's daughter who saw it first. "There's a chicken," she whispered. Her brother shushed her. "No, look, it's under the third bench." The priest paused mid-sentence. "He who sows in sorrow shall reap in." Cluck! The sound echoed louder than it should have. The villagers, trained in the sacred art of ignoring awkward things in sacred places, remained frozen, except for the chicken, who had now perched itself near the altar and was pecking curiously at a discarded bit of wax. The priest closed his book. "Did anyone bring that?" The silence said no. The silence also said, "Let's all agree to pretend it's not happening." Then the chicken flapped. One mighty burst of feathers and indignation, and suddenly it was airborne briefly, before landing squarely in the lap of old Hilda, who had not been sat upon by a living creature in over 3 decades. She let out a yelp that turned into a cough, which turned into a blasphemous mutter, enough to wake even the snorers in the back pew. Chaos bloomed. Children shrieked. Grown men ducked. Someone threw a hymn book not at the chicken, but in its general direction, as if the spirit of psalmody might banish poultry. The priest attempted a prayer, but what came out was, "Lord, deliver us from Cluck." The chicken leapt again, landed on the pulpit, and stared at the congregation like a visiting dignitary from the realm of farmyard heresy. Then it began to preen. "That is not a holy bird," muttered the apothecary. The priest, sweating now, raised his arms as if to summon angels. "This is the work of the devil. The devil's name is Margaret," shouted one of the children, pointing with glee. And just like that, the chicken had a name. "You all right, girl?" he asked softly, his voice laced with genuine concern. She blinked once, then closed her eyes. "That's what I thought." He reached out and gently scratched the patch behind her ear, the one that usually made her twitch her nose and groan like a spoiled baroness. She didn't twitch tonight, just a long exhale, warm and damp, and the faintest shuffle of hooves against the straw. Tomlin stayed there for a while, not doing anything, not thinking about anything either, just breathing with her, listening to the creaks and groans of the barn, feeling the weight of the day slowly loosen its grip. In the loft above, a mouse rustled, probably the same one that had been stealing from the grain sack all week. Tomlin didn't care tonight. Let it have its crumbs. He stood, his bones creaking louder than the barn door. "Good night, Gertrude," he whispered, offering a silent benediction. She didn't reply. Outside, the stars were still watching, thousands of them scattered across the vast expanse of the sky like forgotten seeds. Some bright, some faint, all ancient beyond measure. He paused and looked up for just a second, offering no prayers, harboring no specific thoughts, just a simple glance, just enough to feel small in the right way. Back inside, the village was lost in the depths of its dreams. The baker rolled over and muttered about burnt crusts. The priest mumbled an unfinished sermon. A child somewhere whispered, "Dragon," then snored like one. Even the dogs were still, their tails twitching at fleeting memories of rabbits that had managed to escape their grasp. Tomlin slipped back into the house, careful not to let the door squeal and break the spell of the night. He set the lantern down, pulled off his boots, and slid beneath the blanket beside his wife, who reached out without waking and placed a hand on his chest as if she were silently counting his heartbeats. Outside, the barn stood watch, a silent sentinel against the encroaching darkness. The priest practiced his sermon with a stick and a rather opinionated sheep. The sheep disagreed vehemently with his theology. By the time the sun was fully up, the rooster had gone back to sleep. His job, as far as he was concerned, was done. He'd made a noise. People were moving. The world, however broken and ridiculous, was turning once again. And if no one had quite noticed the exact moment the day began, that was perfectly fine. It wasn't the sort of place where things started cleanly. Here, mornings didn't arrive. They shuffled in, lost a boot in the mud, and hoped no one would ask too many questions. The first true scent of morning wasn't the bread. It wasn't even the fire. It was the warm, wet thwack of old porridge hitting a wooden bowl, and the unmistakable tang of someone's breath who had not, by any stretch of the imagination, encountered a mint leaf in recent memory. In the corner of a crooked cottage, the hearth grumbled to life. Flames licked lazily at damp logs, protesting their workload, while a woman with one eyebrow and zero patience stirred a pot that looked suspiciously like it had never been emptied. The porridge inside bubbled with a resentful plop, thick enough to stand a spoon in, yet thin enough to slide off when no one was looking. Her husband, already shirtless and already sweating, sat hunched over a hunk of rye bread so dense it could easily qualify as a weapon in some kingdoms. He took a bite and paused halfway through chewing, not out of delight, but out of calculation. Was this the same piece from yesterday, or had it been reincarnated from last week's loaf? Either way, it tasted like dust and pure, unadulterated commitment. Next door, a young girl was pouring reused ale into a cracked clay cup for her grandfather, who claimed it settled the stomach, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The cup itself had a chip shaped exactly like the bishop's nose, a fact the family mentioned often and laughed about never. His eyes were crossed, but the charter was done, sort of. Lionel wiped his hands on his tunic, stood, and immediately knocked over the inkwell one final time. He considered screaming. Instead, he whispered, "I shall blame the cat." Then he rolled up the parchment, tied it with twine, and left the room with the gait of a man who had lost a battle, but would survive the war. The charter would be read that night, mispronounced, misunderstood, and forgotten by morning. But somewhere deep within its clauses, a smudge shaped like a paw print would remain proof that at least two beings had cared enough to ruin it completely. The sun was barely up, the mist still loitering in the fields like gossip with nowhere to be, when Edwin was handed a bucket, a rag, and a mission that would haunt him for seasons to come. "Go milk Gertrude," the stable master had said, wiping his hands on his apron as if he'd just gifted Edwin a sacred right. "She's in a mood today. Be gentle." Gertrude was always in a mood. Sometimes that mood was sleepy disdain. Other times it was outright war. She was the only cow in the village with her own nickname among the children, the Throne of Doom, and her stare had been known to make grown men reconsider their professions. Still, Edwin nodded like a fool and accepted the task, mostly because saying no would have meant scrubbing the latrines instead. At 16, he was an apprentice in everything and a master of nothing. He had once tripped over his own shoe while standing still. Today, he was about to learn how to milk a cow. He approached the barn with the reverence of a man entering battle. Birds chirped overhead, blissfully unaware. The rooster finally crowed as if to say, "This is going to be good." Inside, Gertrude stood like a statue carved from indignation and hay. She did not look at Edwin. She looked through him. Her eyes narrowed. Her tail flicked ominously. "Morning," Edwin said softly, trying to sound confident, because the cobbler was not stitching or hammering or meticulously measuring, at least, not in any way that resulted in actual footwear. Instead, he was curled up beneath the bench, surrounded by shoes like a tiny, mismatched army of silent guards. A boot with a gaping hole in the heel, a lonely slipper missing its twin, a sandal with a buckle so rusted it had become a philosophical quandary. The cobbler lay on his side, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his mouth slightly ajar, one hand tucked under his cheek as if he'd slipped back into childhood in the middle of his work. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate rhythm that suggested a man very much not awake, and very much not bothered by it. If you were to knock or cough, or step loudly enough to rouse the floorboards and then inquire as to his activities, he would insist with utter conviction that he was measuring souls. Sometimes, if he was feeling particularly poetic, he'd claim he was in deep conversation with the leather. Once, after an especially prolonged doze, he declared he'd been meditating on the very essence of arches. Everyone indulged him in that one. The truth, of course, was far simpler. He was bone-tired, and the cramped space beneath the bench had become a sort of sanctuary. In his dreams, he was invariably feasting on mutton pies, thick, steaming pies with flaky crusts and gravy that defied the laws of physics. Sometimes there were potatoes, sometimes a flagon that refilled itself as if the dream knew precisely how much he'd need. No one ever interrupted him in these dreams. No one demanded new heels, or requested a tighter instep, or pressed him to fix a buckle before Sunday. Just pie, and quiet, and the soft hum of a world where everything fit perfectly. Above him, life continued its relentless march. A young man stepped into the shop, glanced around, and called out, "Master Cobbler?" So Rose said, eyes forward, voice casual. "You and Will, the miller's apprentice, were walking awful close last market day." Ida didn't respond, just wrung out a tunic with more force than necessary. "You were smiling." He said something funny. He's never said anything funny in his life. A pause. Then Ida, her voice barely a whisper, replied, "He said he likes my laugh." Ro blinked. Oh, there it was. An accidental confession, never intended for sharing, but already too late. Ro grinned like a cat. "That's going to cost you 3 weeks of firewood chores if you want me to keep that quiet." "Too done," Ida countered. At the far end, near a cluster of trees, a woman named Alfreda hummed loudly while beating a tunic that clearly belonged to her husband. With every slap, her hum grew louder. No one asked questions. Eventually, the confessions began to slip out, as they always did, half laughing, half daring. That was the thing about repetitive work. It loosened the tongue. The arms moved on instinct, and the mouth forgot to be careful. "I never liked the midwife," someone said, scrubbing hard. She smells like sour milk and makes too many comments about hips. I kissed my cousin once, another offered. But it was dark, and I didn't know until afterward. I put nettles in my mother-in-law's bedding. Gasps, cackles. I think my husband's having dreams about that tavern girl. You think? Mine moans her name in his sleep. They howled. One woman laughed so hard she dropped her lye bucket into the river and had to wade in after it, muttering prayers that were only technically in Latin. A soft breeze rustled the trees overhead. Birds chirped, oblivious to the drama unfolding below. A frog plopped into the shallows and instantly regretted it. By late morning, the riverbank was a patchwork of drying cloth, damp skirts, and freshly released secrets. Some of the women lay back on the grass, catching their breath. Margaret strutted to the edge of the pulpit, clucked once, then hopped down and made for the baptismal font. "She's going for the water," someone cried. "She seeks redemption," someone else offered. At this point, the chapel was split into 3 factions. Those trying to catch Margaret, those trying not to laugh, and those who had accepted this as part of the liturgy and were humming softly to themselves. The priest was not among the amused. He chased Margaret with a ceremonial candle, shouting something about unclean spirits and poultry in sacred spaces. The candle went out. Margaret escaped. The children cheered. The baker's wife tried to trap her using her shawl. The shawl got torn. Margaret escaped again. Eventually, it was the youngest choir boy, small, quiet, and mostly ignored, who simply crouched and held out a piece of bread. Margaret approached slowly, suspiciously, then took the bread. He scooped her up, arms full of feathers and triumph, and held her like a relic. The congregation applauded. The priest tried to restore order. "Ahem, let us return to prayer," he said, adjusting his robes with a semblance of pride. Margaret was carried out with great ceremony, as if she were a visiting saint being respectfully exiled. Evening prayers resumed, shakier than before. Every few minutes, someone would stifle a giggle. The blacksmith's wife wiped tears from her cheeks. The reeve swore he'd seen a sign. The priest pretended not to see the feather still floating gently near the altar. After the final amen, people filed out quietly, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Except for the children, they clustered near the steps, whispering to each other. "She's our chicken now," one declared. "She's chosen. Margaret the Holy. Margaret the Terrible." They couldn't agree on her title, but they did agree she should live in the shed behind the chapel and be fed every Wednesday. No one asked the priest's permission. Inside, Gertrude sighed, rolled once, and finally settled into a comfortable position. And above it all, the stars blinked slow and silent, keeping secrets that only the night could truly understand. Outside, more hearths began their morning chorus. Wood snapped, metal clanged. Somewhere someone screamed, "Not again!" and a chicken was launched gently out of a window. The rituals had begun. Hygiene in the village was more of a suggestion, a whisper, an idea one might consider if time allowed, which it usually didn't. A man stood shirtless by a water barrel, splashing his face with such ferocity you'd think he was trying to erase it. Another used the corner of a tunic that clearly belonged to someone else to wipe his nose. A woman scrubbed her armpits with a handful of moss and muttered something that may have been a prayer or a curse. Maybe both. Tooth care was creative. Some chewed sticks. Others rubbed ashes on their gums with their fingers. One bold soul insisted on using sour milk, claiming it scared the rot away. It also scared away conversation. In one home, a child with tangled hair attempted to tame it by licking his palm and smacking his curls into submission. His mother watched and said nothing, mostly because she was too busy trying to remove a slug from her shoe without waking the baby balanced precariously on her back. The bread ovens, at least, were a source of pride. That is, if your definition of pride included guessing whether today's crust would crack your teeth clean or just chip them slightly. The dough was often mixed with whatever was available. Oats, barley, the last handful of seeds someone forgot to plant. On a lucky day, there might be a walnut. On an unlucky day, a pebble. At the edge of the village, A man known only as Cricket was lighting his stove with a self-satisfied smirk. He claimed his bread rose better when he sang to it. The bread disagreed, but the singing continued regardless. His neighbors didn't complain. They just made sure to be exceptionally loud about enjoying anyone else's loaf. Sacred rituals dotted the morning like breadcrumbs no one particularly wanted to follow. "I'm here to, do the milking." Gertrude didn't respond. She shifted her weight slightly, which might have meant "come closer" or "prepare to die." It was hard to tell. He placed the bucket gently beneath her, crouched precariously on the stool that wobbled if you breathed too hard, and reached out with trembling hands. He had been told the technique, thumb and forefinger, then the rest of the fingers like squeezing a pouch of mead, but the udders felt like warm, twitchy balloons and just touching them made him flinch. "Sorry," he whispered to Gertrude. Gertrude sneezed directly onto his face. Edwin wiped his eyes and tried again. He gave one slow, cautious tug. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. He looked up, and Gertrude chewed with infuriating slowness, a bovine smirk plastered on her face that seemed anatomically impossible. "Please," Edwin begged, his voice strained. In the distance, a rumble, thunder, perhaps, or just the baker's rickety cart, added an ominous note to the already tense situation. He adjusted his grip on the bucket, tugged again with renewed resolve, but only managed a pathetic squirt of milk against the pail's side, the sound an insulting echo of his efforts. "Progress," he muttered, clinging to a shred of hope. Then Gertrude moved, a feat of both physical defiance and utter disrespect. With a twist that mocked the laws of nature and any sense of decency, she swung her rear leg in a perfectly calculated kick. The bucket became airborne, the stool toppled, and Edwin found himself unceremoniously deposited in a heap of straw that reeked of forgotten failures. "All right?" he gasped, sprawled on his back, eyes fixed on the rafters above. "Scratch that progress remark." Gertrude merely turned her head, snorted dismissively, and resumed her cud chewing. Edwin pushed himself up, now adorned with a coating of milk, straw, and a thick layer of humiliation. Receiving no answer, he frowned, leaned over the counter, and caught sight of a boot twitching almost imperceptibly beneath the bench. A faint snore confirmed his suspicions. He waited a respectful moment, then tiptoed back out, deciding that the shoe could, in fact, wait another day. No one wanted to be the one to wake the cobbler. Not because he was prone to outbursts, he wasn't. He was simply slow to return to the waking world. His eyes took an inordinate amount of time to focus. His words emerged like a soup that hadn't quite come to a boil, and once, he'd mistaken a broom for a customer and tried to sell it a pair of sandals. Back in the shadowed depths beneath the bench, the cobbler smacked his lips and smiled in his sleep. The mutton pie was particularly exquisite today. Outside, the village hummed with activity. The blacksmith's hammer rang out like a discordant set of church bells. Children shrieked with delight during a game of Chase the Chicken, and the miller cursed about something that was probably entirely his own fault. And in the midst of it all, the shoemaker napped on, undisturbed, enveloped in the comforting sense of tanned hide and baked fantasy. His apprentice, a lanky boy named Joss, eventually poked his head into the shop. He spotted the boots in progress, the scattered tools, the complete lack of movement, and sighed with the weary resignation of a man twice his age. "Again," he muttered under his breath. He walked quietly behind the bench, crouched down, and gently slid a rolled-up piece of felt under the cobbler's neck. The old man shifted slightly, mumbled something about gravy, and settled deeper into his slumber. Joss didn't mind. He liked the quiet. He liked the way the shop felt like a shared secret between them. He even liked that his master sometimes chose to dream rather than work. It somehow made the shoes he did finish feel a little more magical, as if they'd emerged from a place that wasn't entirely of this world. Others kept scrubbing, not because the clothes needed it, but because it gave their hands something to do while their minds untangled new rumors. A girl who had barely spoken all morning suddenly said, "I think I want to marry someone who doesn't live here." Silence descended. Then a quiet voice replied, Good luck finding one who wants to live with you. More laughter. Eventually, the sun climbed too high, and the work began to slow. Baskets were refilled, tunics folded. The river, now cloudy with soap and sins, gurgled softly, as if promising to keep their secrets, at least until tomorrow. As they trudged back to the village, arms full and mouth still moving, one thing was certain. Before the next bell rang, every one of those confessions would echo off someone else's kitchen wall. The clothes would be clean, but the stories never. He arrived with a lute slung over his back and the swagger of someone who mistook mild applause for prophecy. The villagers welcomed him, of course. That's what you did when a minstrel came through. Offer him a bowl of soup, a spot near the fire, maybe a place in the barn if he didn't smell too strongly. He'd play a few songs, tell a tale or two, then vanish with the next cart of turnips. But this one stayed. First, it was charming. His name, he insisted, was Sir Eldritch of the Seven Strings, though no one could verify whether that referred to his lute or something more anatomical. He wore a hat with an absurd feather and spoke in poetic riddles, even when asking for directions to the outhouse. "In the year of our Lord, may I inquire where yon latrine doth reside?" he once asked old Murda, who simply pointed and muttered, "Over there, and don't yawn me." He performed in the square every evening without fail. The first night, the children danced. The second, the butcher's wife clapped along. By the fifth, most people found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, like checking on non-existent goats or rearranging firewood. That night, the village slept with the vague, amused satisfaction of people who had witnessed something both ridiculous and vaguely divine. The stars above twinkled like candlelight, and somewhere behind the chapel, Margaret nestled into a pile of straw, unaware that she had achieved accidental sainthood. And in the village's collective memory, long after the candles had burned out and the hymn books had been repaired, this night would be known simply as the time Margaret invaded the chapel, and everything got just a little more holy. By the time the last chores were done, and the wind had curled its fingers through the thatched rooftops, the villagers began to gather, not by invitation, never that formal, but by instinct, as if the crackling hearth sent out a silent summons to all souls within earshot. One by one, they slipped inside the great hall beside the tavern, where the fire burned steady, and the benches were just soft enough to tolerate for an hour or two. The flames danced against the soot-darkened stone, painting shadows on the walls that looked like giants one moment and chickens the next. The room smelled of smoke, damp wool, old onions, and the faintest trace of mead. A pot hung over the fire, bubbling something that claimed to be soup, though it was mostly memories and a single carrot floating like a survivor. Children curled in corners, chewing bread crusts and pretending not to fall asleep. Elders leaned on elbows. Middle-aged men stretched out their legs in exaggerated comfort, even as they quietly rubbed their knees. Women passed around a cloth of boiled chestnuts and made quiet bets about how long it would take before someone mentioned dragons. Then came the stories. It always started with Tolan, the miller's cousin. No one knew what exactly he did somewhere between brewing, borrowing, and bothering, but he had a voice like gravel and a gift for exaggeration. "Did I ever tell you about the time I met the ghost in the barley fields?" A few families knelt by their doors, murmuring blessings with half-closed eyes and fully empty stomachs. The priest's bell rang once, though no one was quite sure why, as he was still fast asleep in the chapel with a candle melted artfully into his hair. One woman tied garlic to her baby's ankle to ward off demons. Another spat over her left shoulder after feeding the dog, just in case. A boy rubbed mud on his forehead for strength, then promptly tripped over a bucket and blamed the mud for not working fast enough. There was something both chaotic and deeply comforting about these ingrained rhythms. Everyone had a part to play, even if their part involved burning the stew, cursing the cat, or waking up with half a beetle in their bed. No one knew how these habits had started. They were simply passed down, picked up, misunderstood, misused, and stubbornly repeated. By the time the sun climbed higher, the air was thick with smoke, salt, and a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had a clean spoon. The porridge had begun to solidify into something vaguely resembling glue. The reused ale was already room temperature, which was not a compliment. And the bread. The bread was cooling on crooked shelves, daring anyone to complain. Morning had arrived fully now, not because the rooster decreed it, and not because any clock had struck anything. There were no clocks, and the rooster was still nursing his wounded pride. No, the day began when breath turned to chatter, and smoke rose from hearths, and people, despite everything, got on with the business of surviving. One crust, one cough, and one sacredly strange ritual at a time. They gathered like clockwork, not the loud, boisterous kind of gathering with shouting, barrels, and broken fiddles. No, this was quieter, sharper, more dangerous. A semicircle of old women planted themselves near the well just after sunrise, armed with shawls, strong tea, and tongues sharper than most swords in the village. His tunic clung to him in milky patches, and his hair looked as if a bewildered ghost had tried to groom it. The bucket, dented and defeated, lay on its side like a fallen crown. Resolutely, he retrieved it, brushed it off, and returned to the stool with the grim determination of a martyr and the dejected posture of a drowned rat. "Okay," he muttered again, trying a new tactic. He began to hum, a soft, wavering tune that sounded like a bizarre blend of lullaby and funeral dirge. He gave the udder a gentler tug, eyes squeezed shut, desperately hoping Gertrude might be the type of cow who appreciated a little mood music. To his astonishment, she remained still. A thin, hesitant stream of milk began to trickle into the bucket. He held his breath, didn't dare blink, and milked slowly, rhythmically, imagining the faint sound of applause in the distance. Then came the tail. It lashed out with the force and precision of a whip designed by the devil himself, connecting with his cheek and mouth in a wet smack that tasted of manure and profound betrayal. The bucket tipped once more, spilling the hard-won milk like a sacrificial offering to the gods of humiliation. Gertrude let out a low, satisfied moo. By the time the stable master returned, Edwin was slumped against the barn door, utterly defeated. His hands ached, his shirt was a disaster, and his face wore an expression of quiet, lingering trauma. "Well?" the stable master asked, arms crossed, a hint of amusement in his voice. Edwin looked up, defeated. "She gave me something. Milk, mostly contempt." The man chuckled, glancing at the cow. "She only respects two people, the priest and the old widow who feeds her honey oats on Thursdays. Everyone else is just a target." Gertrude snorted in agreement. Edwin stood, wordlessly handed over the dented bucket, and wiped his hands on what little dignity he had left. Back under the bench, the cobbler's fingers twitched. Perhaps he was tying an imaginary shoelace. Perhaps he was reaching for another bite of pie. No one could ever know. A spider wandered across his boot, paused thoughtfully, and then thought better of it. The snoring grew softer, the light shifted subtly, and time passed in its usual unhurried fashion, full of hidden corners. Eventually, the cobbler would wake up. He'd stretch, smack his lips, and feign having been meticulously checking a seam. He might even utter, "Ah, yes, it's nearly ready," as if the shoe beneath his bench had been ripening like a fine cheese. But for now, the cobbler slept on, shoes all around him, lost in a world of mutton pies and quiet contentment, and not a single soul dared to wake him. The bell tolled softly over the village, a gentle reminder that evening vespers were drawing near. Chickens squawked in distant corners, dogs barked as if defending the very foundations of the faith, and the air began to settle with that peculiar, glowing hush that made every shadow appear just a little longer than it ought to be. In the chapel, Father Aldrich stood as still as a statue, a posture that would have been admirable were it not for the creeping wave of sheer panic that was spreading across his face. He had, in that precise moment, forgotten everything. Not his name, he clung to that with fierce determination, and not his vocation. He was reasonably certain he was still a priest, but the sermon, the carefully crafted scroll, the chosen passage from Luke that he'd been rehearsing all morning while feeding the geese, it had vanished completely, utterly, gloriously, from his mind, like smoke through a sieve. He glanced around the sacristy, which resembled less a room of holy preparation and more the interior of a cupboard that had completely given up. The problem wasn't just that he stayed. It was that he only knew 3 songs, exactly 3. One about a brave knight who loved a swan, which grew less romantic the more you thought about it. One about a miller's daughter and some deeply questionable metaphors, and one called The Wind Doth Moan for Thee, which involved a lot of moaning, literal moaning. He hit the same note at least 17 times. When asked if he knew anything else, he'd smile as if mistaken for royalty and reply, "Ah, but these are sacred tales crafted under moonlight and muse, and overcooked," muttered the baker's son. It wasn't just the songs, though. It was how every tale began. In the year of our Lord. It didn't matter what he was talking about. A dragon in the year of our Lord. A beast of flame. A stolen pie. In the year of our Lord. A most wicked pastry vanished. Once, he tried to explain the rules of a dice game to the blacksmith using the same opening. The blacksmith nodded politely, then threw the dice into the fire. He lingered at the inn, strumming softly, waiting for someone to request a tune. No one did. He wandered into the chapel, claiming the acoustics helped him commune with the divine, though the priest gently asked him to refrain from turning psalms into limericks. He wandered the fields, serenading cows. "They're more forgiving than people," he sighed one afternoon beside Gertrude, the largest and least impressed of the herd. By the second week, he began inserting himself into conversations. "You know, in the year of our Lord." "Don't," someone would say. But he would. The children began avoiding him, fearing another rendition of the swan song. The apothecary swore her sleeping draughts were selling better than ever. The innkeeper, who had initially offered a straw pallet out of courtesy, started hinting that the weather was fine enough to sleep under the stars. Eldritch took this as a compliment to his endurance. He wasn't entirely useless. A chorus of groans, a few grins. "Yes," shouted the children. "No," shouted Tolan, ignoring them. That was his brother. This was the older ghost, meaner, drunker, smelled like turnips. The story spiraled quickly, barley that whispered. A ghost with one boot and a fondness for whistling at sheep. A chase that ended with Tolan locked in a grain bin overnight. "You just passed out in there," muttered someone. "Semantics," he replied. Next came Ma, who claimed she once knew a man who wrestled a bear for romantic reasons. No one believed her, especially since the bear was later revealed to be a very large dog, and the romance ended in a splintered fence and 2 missing teeth. Still, she told it well, and her voice rose and fell like a fiddle tune, making even the nonsense feel noble. Then there was Wilfred, who always told the same story about a chicken that laid an egg shaped like a perfect cube. Every time, the details changed slightly. Tonight, the chicken's name was Judith, and the egg was mistaken for a dice and used in a game that ended a marriage. Between stories, mugs clinked, logs shifted, and someone threw another stick on the fire. Sparks jumped as if they had somewhere to be. A hush fell when old Bram spoke up. He rarely did. He was missing 2 fingers and all of his patience, but he told stories as if he'd bottled time. "This one's true," he said, which was how you knew it absolutely wasn't. He told of a knight who had no horse, only a very determined goat named Cyril. The knight rode Cyril into battle, or tried to, and the goat responded by eating part of his armor. They never made it past the village gate, but somehow Bram spun it into a tale of destiny, betrayal, and goat-based prophecy. By the end, people were wiping tears from their eyes, some from laughter, others from sheer confusion. The fire snapped louder, as if laughing, too. Children now dozed, heads on laps, breath slow and deep. Their backs were hunched, but their hearing was impeccable. Their knees ached, but their memories were flawless, especially when it came to other people's worst moments. The well itself had been there longer than any of them. It sagged slightly to the left and creaked when the wind changed, as if it too was trying to chime in on the gossip. A wooden bucket swung lazily on its frayed rope, listening in as if it had ears. Bertha was always first, a widow since the flood of 21. Not the big one, mind you, the smaller one that only knocked over the pig shed. She arrived with her oat cakes tucked neatly in a cloth napkin, and her lips already pursed in anticipation. Her gossip didn't need to warm up. It came out hot, fast, and slightly singed. "Did you see the baker's wife?" She asked no one in particular. "Wearing yellow. At her age. Martha, who was once a midwife and now just a professional skeptic, sniffed dismissively. "Bold or desperate? I heard," said Agnes, the smallest and perhaps most dangerous of the trio, "that she's sweet on the cooper, always asking for barrels she doesn't need." The well creaked in agreement, or maybe it just shifted. Either way, the mood thickened like stew left too long over the fire. "Barrels she doesn't need," Bertha repeated, tearing off a corner of her oat cake with more force than necessary. "That's what got her sister in trouble, too. Always needing things she didn't need." They all nodded. The kind of nod that carries the weight of at least 4 decades of silently judging people who walked too fast, smiled too wide, or enjoyed anything too enthusiastically. A fourth woman joined, limping slightly and dragging a stool she claimed belonged to her late husband, but clearly hadn't unless he'd been child-sized. This was Elizabeth, who only spoke when she could no longer contain herself, which wasn't often. She sat, unfolded a suspiciously dry apple, and said, "I saw the priest leave the tavern last night with hay in his beard. He couldn't claim to have mastered the art of milking that day, but he'd certainly learned how not to, which in most villages counted for something." And Gertrude, regal and unbothered, remained queen of the barn, guardian of her precious milk, watching the boy retreat with her tail swishing in slow, victorious arcs. The sun was still relatively low when the village children were unleashed into the fields for what the adults optimistically called important work. Important, that is, in the sense that it kept them out of the bakery, away from the priest, and, ideally, far from anything easily broken. They were instructed to gather weeds from the edges of the barley rows. They were also instructed not to hit each other with shovels, not to climb the scarecrow again, and most emphatically, not to pretend to die in front of passing travelers. These requests were generally understood, though rarely remembered. A dozen or so children erupted into the fields like a flock of noisy birds, armed with small shovels, woven baskets, and the kind of boundless energy that made even goats nervous. Their clothes were patched and faded, their shoes mismatched, and their priorities perfectly clear. Dig something up, throw it, and if possible, collapse dramatically afterward. Thomas, age 9 and already missing 2 front teeth thanks to a series of unrelated incidents, declared himself commander of dirt, and promptly appointed a council consisting of whichever children hadn't scattered at the sound of his booming voice. His first official decree was the formation of a shovel brigade. "You dig, you duck, and if you get hit, you scream," he announced proudly, brandishing his shovel like a knight wielding a particularly flat sword. Marigold, the eldest at nearly 12 and far too intelligent for her current environment, rolled her eyes with such force it almost counted as a full-body workout. Robes were slung haphazardly over chairs, candles leaned drunkenly against the walls, and a chalice rested upside down on a stack of hymnals that had been propping up a wobbly stool for the past 3 months. Somewhere, a mouse scampered about with the kind of brazen confidence that only divine proximity could inspire. "All right," Father Aldrich muttered to himself, frantically lifting papers, lifting books, lifting a crust of bread that had somehow morphed into a theological hazard. Where did I had it this morning." He checked under the table, behind the altar, and in the cabinet where he'd once accidentally locked a vestment for Lent, only to remember it during Pentecost. But the scripture remained stubbornly elusive. Then he noticed something else, something decidedly more chilling. He looked down. No shoes. His feet, pale and slightly taken aback by the cold stone floor, blinked back at him as if to inquire, "Good sir, why are we naked in God's house?" "Oh, not again," Aldrich whispered, shuffling towards the far corner where he kept what he referred to as his emergency shoes, a mismatched pair that had once belonged to a monk with one leg slightly longer than the other. He slid them on with the weary resignation of a man who had long ago sacrificed both fashion and symmetry in service to a higher calling. Outside, the village was already gathering. The baker's wife stood chatting with the apothecary, likely discussing yeast or the nature of sin. A handful of children were throwing pebbles at the chapel door in what they insisted was a game, rather than a blatant act of low-grade heresy. And somewhere near the steps, Old Man Trigg had fallen asleep against a barrel and would likely remain there until someone tripped over him in the dark. Father Aldrich wiped his brow, muttering to himself, "Vespers, evening vespers, that means light, hope, repentance, shoes." He blinked. No, he had shoes now. Wrong train of thought. He helped carry baskets. He once patched a hole in the tavern roof, though he sang while doing it. He was polite, clean somehow, and never stole a thing. But his presence clung like flour dust. Impossible to remove, slightly sweet, but mostly annoying. A secret meeting was held behind the granary. What if we tell him there's a music contest in the next town? He'll come back with a trophy. Can we bribe him with what? Our remaining patience? Someone suggested sending him into the forest to serenade bears. Another floated the idea of marriage. Surely someone in a far-off village would take him eventually, but no one had the heart to be cruel. He meant well. He smiled like a dog that didn't know it had tracked mud into the chapel. And he was trying, always trying. One evening, the village gathered around the well. A cool breeze stirred the lanterns. Eldritch appeared, lute in hand, eyes shining. "Friends," he began, "in the year of our Lord, groans, audible groans, I shall perform a new piece." Heads snapped up. "New?" He cleared his throat, strummed once, then silence. "I forgot the second verse," he said sheepishly. "But I remember the chorus." It was, unfortunately, the moaning part. Still, he sang it. People laughed, not at the song, but at the spectacle. Someone handed him a crust of bread. A child danced badly, and for a moment, the irritation faded. He was still terrible, but he was theirs now. Every morning, just after the sun spilled across the thatched rooftops, and long before anyone truly wanted to be awake, the village reeve began his rounds. He walked with the ceremonial authority of someone who'd been given a job no one else wanted, but everyone was happy to let him keep. His name was Eden, and he took boredom more seriously than most men took their vows. He wore the same brown cloak every day, a garment that somehow managed to look both stiff and sagging, as if it harbored opinions but lacked the courage to voice them. One boy dreamed with his eyes open, staring into the flames as if they might tell a story back. Outside, the wind howled just once, a reminder that the world beyond the hearth was wide and cold and uncaring. But in here, the walls held steady, the laughter held longer. Rhea told a tale of a man who sneezed so hard it dislodged a tooth and changed the outcome of a local election. Someone else added a bit about a woman who claimed to hear bees in her bread, which turned out to be true, and the bread had to be exorcised. I once saw a duck walk into the tavern, quack 3 times and leave. Was it a real duck? Define real. The stories blurred into one another like watercolors left in the rain. Impossible to separate truth from jest or memory from invention. And that was the point. Stories weren't for record-keeping. They were for warmth, for distraction, for stretching a single evening into something that felt longer, fuller, and less ordinary. Eventually, the yawns came in waves. Boots scraped the floor. Cloaks were pulled tight. One by one, the villagers stood, nodded good nights, and slipped back into the night. Only the fire remained awake, low and glowing, whispering to the last embers about goats and ghosts, and the strange things people believe when the stars are out and the stew's been shared. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, cows to milk, pies to burn. But tonight, there had been dragons and square eggs, and the memory of laughter echoing in the smoke. Night fell slowly, as if it, too, was reluctant to lie down in this particular village. The last embers of daylight slipped behind the hills, and one by one, candles were snuffed out, shutters creaked closed, and people climbed into beds that could generously be described as wooden excuses for comfort. Inside the cottages, the world narrowed, and a bruise on his forehead. There was a silence so heavy, even the birds paused their chirping. "With hay?" Martha asked, aghast. Agnes blinked as if she'd just received divine confirmation. "Well," said Bertha slowly, "he did give quite the sermon on temptation last week. Said we must all be tested," said Elizabeth, biting into her apple and chewing it like a statement. A donkey passed behind them, braying loudly and dragging a cart full of nothing. They didn't even glance up. The donkey was not their concern today. Today it was the priest, the cooper, the baker's wife, and the woman from 2 cottages down who was seen planting something in her garden after midnight. "What sort of herb grows at that hour?" Martha asked with raised eyebrows. "The sort that gets your chickens to lay twice as fast," muttered Agnes. "The sort that gets your husband to speak less," added Bertha. They all sighed, not wistfully but strategically. A young girl approached the well with a bucket far too large for her arms. Her eyes were wide with apprehension. She greeted them with a quiet murmur and reached for the rope. "Careful," Bertha warned. "That rope frays more every day. And if it snaps," Martha added, "you'll end up in the well and hear everything we said twice." The girl nodded far too quickly, nearly lost her grip on the crank, and retreated the moment the bucket hit the edge. She spilled half the water on her dress and didn't even look back. Agnes watched her go. "That one's too quiet. Quiet ones always marry wrong." Elizabeth grunted. "Quiet ones listen too much, just like us." She was supposed to be supervising, but instead found herself dodging a rotten turnip that whizzed past her ear. "That was a warning shot," yelled a boy named Pip, who was never quite sure what he was warning anyone about. The battle commenced shortly thereafter. It wasn't a battle for land or glory or honor. It was a battle against boredom, a desperate grab for attention, a competition to see who could yell, "I've been struck," with the most theatrical flair, collapsing to the earth like a wounded bard reciting his final verse. Turnips became ammunition, clumps of damp soil transformed into crude grenades, sticks were repurposed as staffs, and someone fashioned a helmet from a cracked bucket and half a bird's nest. At one point, a girl named Elsie lay face down in the grass, arms outstretched, murmuring, "Tell my goat I loved her," as if breathlessly delivering her last message to the world. No one questioned this. A younger boy, barely 5 years old, wandered through the midst of the chaos with a dandelion crown perched atop his head, completely oblivious to the war raging around him. He was gently struck by a flying potato and sat down to contemplate the profound mysteries of existence. 2 boys engaged in what could only be described as a duel, their flat shovels clanging together with the precision of a blacksmith and the wisdom of a brick. One tripped, the other declared victory, and launched into a victory song composed entirely of gibberish. Everyone applauded, then booed, then applauded again. A nearby farmer, hoe in hand, glanced up from his work, surveyed the scene of utter mayhem, and promptly returned to his furrows. He'd seen worse. Last spring, they'd stolen a wheelbarrow and raced it downhill into the river. One of them had emerged riding a goose like a chariot. He'd learned not to ask questions anymore. Meanwhile, the weed baskets remained conspicuously empty. He grabbed the nearest Bible, flipping through it as if searching for a long-lost recipe, and landed on something vaguely familiar. Loaves, fishes, yes. He'd talk about abundance, about trusting in the process, about how even when things seemed lost, something greater found its way. Perfect, he thought, feeling a sliver of hope. Symbolic, relevant, and vaguely edible. As he straightened his robe, artfully tucking the telltale candle wax stains into a fold that no one would ever see, he offered a short, silent prayer, not to remember the sermon, but simply to survive it. His memory had never been his strong suit. Once, he'd accidentally read a marriage blessing over a baptism. The baby hadn't seemed to mind. The couple left somewhat confused, but oddly optimistic. He stepped out of the sacristy and into the soft, amber light of the chapel. The villagers turned, their faces sleepy, warm, and expectant. He smiled at them, the same smile a man might wear when he realizes his fly is undone and there's absolutely nothing he can do about it now. "Good evening," he said, his voice echoing slightly more than he intended. "Tonight's reading is about trust. He held up the Bible like a shield. No one could see the page. In fact, he wasn't even sure if it was right side up. "There are times," he began, improvising with a newfound sense of recklessness, "when we are certain that we've prepared, that we've done all that we're meant to do, and yet we find ourselves standing barefoot in the house of God." He paused, took a breath, and gave a knowing glance down at his mismatched shoes. A ripple of chuckles spread through the room. He pressed on, emboldened by their amusement. "We forget things, small things, where we left the bread, where we left our temper, where we left a scroll containing our entire sermon for the evening. But God remembers even when we don't." A murmur of approval swept through the congregation. A small wooden badge hung around his neck to signify his office, though most villagers assumed it was a token from a failed romance. He walked slowly, as if each step had been pre-approved by a committee, which, in a way, it had. The job of Reeve, after all, was mostly about appearances. He began at the east fence, where the slats had been half missing since Candlemas. He squinted at the damage, rubbed his chin thoughtfully, and moved on without comment. That was the ritual. Check the fences, don't fix the fences, pretend you're making a list of the fences. "Morning, Reeve," called a voice from the cowpen. Eden nodded. "A fair morning to you, Hilda. Fences down again?" "Yes," she said with the gravity of a man reporting on war. "I've noticed." He did not stop. If he stopped, someone might ask him to do something. So he walked past the broken fence, past the one held together with a belt, past the one that had been replaced entirely with bundles of dried reeds and wishful thinking. The next stop was the grain store. He checked the lock, which wasn't locked. He checked the hinges, which were mostly rust and prayer. He tapped the wood twice, his version of an inspection, and moved on. Inside, a mouse stared at him with the confident gaze of someone who paid no taxes. He walked the perimeter of the pasture where the sheep sometimes remembered to stay. A few stared at him, unimpressed. One followed briefly, then lost interest. Eden stopped to inspect a gate that was technically attached but mostly leaning. He placed one hand on it, sighed deeply, then stepped back and gave it a nod, as if to say, "You're doing your best." By mid-morning, he reached the manor's outer wall. It was solid, imposing, and entirely outside his jurisdiction. He stared at it anyway, just to feel included. A servant passed, carrying a basket of apples. "Reeve," she said with a small curtsy. "Walls seem sturdy," he noted, gesturing vaguely. She looked at the wall, then at him, then kept walking. The clatter and chatter of day faded into the soft rustle of blankets stuffed with straw, the occasional clink of a chamber pot lid, and the heavy sighs of bodies surrendering to sleep or trying to. It was not a peaceful process. Snoring began almost immediately, not a soft, dignified snore, but a full-throated, furniture-rattling declaration of unconsciousness, the sort of sound that suggested the sleeper was in a wrestling match with his own throat and winning decisively. It started in the blacksmith's hut, always him, and then, as if in reply, another snore erupted from 3 doors down, slightly higher in pitch, like a duet no one had asked for. A dog whimpered in its sleep. A baby coughed once and then decided against waking. The wind tapped a loose shutter. Somewhere, someone muttered, "Turn over, you old donkey," and received a grunt in response, followed by a loud, wet-sounding fart. That, too, was part of the nightly symphony. Flatulence had no shame in this village. It was considered a sign of health, vigor, and, occasionally, victory. The baker's wife had once claimed her husband farted so loudly it scared the rats out of the grain store. Whether this was true or not, the rats were gone, and the baker was proud. Tonight, the gas was especially sociable. A rhythmic series echoed from the tanner's cottage, followed by laughter. He and his wife made a game of guessing what animal each one sounded like. "That was definitely a goose," she whispered. In another hut, 2 teenage boys lay on opposite ends of a lumpy mattress, giggling like fools. "Did you hear that?" "No, that was you." "Was not." I felt the draft. They dissolved into giggles again, muffling the sound with pillows that had once been sacks of grain. And through it all, the fleas, those tireless revelers, held their nightly soiree. True insomniacs of the village, they were the tiny despots of the bedding, ruling the straw mattresses with impunity. The shovels, intended for gentle tilling, were now covered in dents, mud, and possibly one unfortunate snail. No one had gathered anything remotely useful, except for a curious clump of moss that someone insisted was magical and kept tucked away in their pocket for good luck. Marigold eventually abandoned all attempts at supervision and began constructing a precarious tower of rocks in silent protest. For a while, it reached an impressive height before someone mistook it for an enemy fortress and demolished it with a well-aimed parsnip. There was a brief moment of truce when someone announced the discovery of a rabbit hole. Everyone gathered, wide-eyed and reverent, hoping to catch a glimpse of twitching ears. The rabbit, however, remained stubbornly hidden. Instead, a heated argument erupted over what to name it. Suggestions included Surflop, Mud King, and the somewhat sacrilegious Dirt Jesus. No decision was reached. The sun continued its ascent, casting long shadows across the field where children lay sprawled like fallen soldiers, clutching their sides and gasping with laughter. They were stained with grass, dust, and several unidentifiable substances best left unexplored. Their hands were blistered, their hair was full of burrs, and their faces glowed with the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of a good, pointless fight. Finally, a bell rang faintly from the village square, signaling lunchtime. A collective groan went up, not because they weren't hungry, but because the war had just been getting good. Still, they rose, shaking off dirt and honor, and began their slow retreat back through the fields. Thomas walked with a pronounced limp that he definitely hadn't possessed 10 minutes earlier. Marigold carried a single, solitary weed in her basket, more symbolic than useful. Pip clutched a lump of turnip like a hard-won trophy. Gertrude the cow watched them pass with deep, bovine judgment. Someone in the back whispered, "That's the truth, right there," and someone else shushed them with a loving elbow. Father Aldrich smiled, now feeling more genuine than he had all day. The panic had softened, replaced by a kind of rhythmic improvisation. He found the parable he sought, tucked away in the folds of his memory. Not word for word, perhaps, but heart for heart. "And so we gather," he concluded, his voice resonating with newfound conviction. "Not to be perfect, but simply to be present." By the end, no one suspected he hadn't planned a single word of it. The villagers left lighter, if not necessarily holier. The children stopped throwing pebbles at the chapel door. Even old man Trigg stirred once, belched contentedly, and muttered, "Amen." Back in the sacristy, Aldrich sank heavily into a chair, kicked off the uneven shoes, and exhaled deeply into his hands. He still had no idea where he'd left the original sermon, but as he leaned back and closed his eyes glazed over, Tom's mind drifted to a delectable vision of mutton pies. For a fleeting moment, he welcomed the distraction. Beyond the village, in the beet field where the clinging soil seemed to suffer from abandonment issues, something akin to love was tentatively unfolding. Her name was Anwin, his was Tom. Both were 17, remarkably inept at most things, save for feigning indifference toward one another. The sun beat down, the beets proved stubborn, and the silence between them was a tangible presence. Tom was supposed to be working, as was Anwin. The village had designated this section of the field as communal, meaning everyone took turns pretending to care about the harvest, while mostly gossiping and bickering over root size. Today, fate, or more likely the knowing Marigold, had paired Tom and Anwin. They toiled side by side, mostly in silence. Tom cleared his throat. "Some of these beets are quite round today," he offered. Anwin looked up, beet in hand, a smudge of dirt on her nose. At the well, he paused to inspect the bucket rope for fraying. It had frayed last spring and frayed further every week since. But so long as the water still came up and no one drowned, it remained a future problem. Eden tugged at it once. The bucket creaked. Satisfied, he moved on. His notebook was mostly blank. He sometimes pretended to write things down, but the quill was dry, and he'd forgotten the ink 3 years ago. Still, people respected the performance. That was the key. The villagers didn't want a reeve who solved problems. They wanted one who noticed them, made a serious face, and then moved along like a man burdened with invisible calculations. He made his way to the pigsty, which wasn't part of his official rounds but had become a personal ritual. The pigs liked him. He didn't know why. Maybe it was his pace. Maybe it was because he never asked anything of them. He leaned on the gate, watching as one snorted and rolled in the mud with theatrical joy. "Must be nice," he muttered. He continued along the main path, passing the blacksmith whose hammering was far too fervent and deafening for polite conversation. Eden raised a hand in greeting. "Fences holding up?" The blacksmith grunted, an ambiguous sound that could have meant yes, or perhaps go away and leave me to it. By the time he reached the village's edge, where the old millstone served as a makeshift bench, the sun was high, and his official duties were technically complete. He sat, exhaled deeply, and removed his reeve badge, placing it on his lap like a paperweight of responsibility. Little had been achieved, nothing definitively fixed, no scrolls penned. Yet, every villager who saw him knew the reeve had made his rounds. And perhaps that was enough. A young boy, trailing drips of water and peals of laughter, ran past with a broken bucket. Ed watched him go, leaned back against the stone bench and surveyed the village. It was, after all, still standing. The instant human skin met the rough weave, the fleas sprang into action, as if a curtain had risen on opening night. Each bite was a calculated strike. Itches erupted, unwelcome floral blooms across the skin. Sleepers scratched, some groaning softly in their fitful slumber. One woman, hovering between wakefulness and dreams, slapped her leg and hissed, "Got you, you little demon!" before rolling over in imagined triumph. The apothecary, with a wink and a shrug, peddled a flea-repelling salve concocted of garlic, mint, and a hefty dose of wishful thinking. It proved effective for a single night, a brief respite. Then the fleas returned, emboldened and in greater numbers. Dreams, strange and slippery, began to churn. The blacksmith dreamt of a dancing cow, its bovine gaze filled with harsh judgment. A young girl envisioned her chicken possessing the gift of speech, accusing her of petty theft. The reeve, ever noble, even in sleep, mumbled official-sounding pronouncements concerning fences and cabbage law, pronouncements he would surely deny in the light of day. In the manor house, the steward's rhythmic snores were so consistent they were mistaken for the steady beat of a drum. The housemaid dreamt of a grand feast where the spoons sprouted legs and scurried away just as the soup was about to be served. In a humble cottage, a widow dreamt of her departed husband, not as he was, but as she wished he had been. A man who didn't snore, who smelled of rosemary, and who knew how to lead her in a dance. Down in the common house, the last embers flickered in the hearth. One man sat bolt upright in his sleep, eyes fluttering, muttering incoherently about taxes and trousers, a common lament. His bunkmate, used to these nightly disturbances, nudged him back down. Even the animals joined the somnambulistic chorus. A pig snorted in its pen, chasing phantoms through its dreams, perhaps a runaway apple, perhaps a long-held grudge. Back in the fields, the overturned soil bore witness to a morning well wasted. Small footprints, broken roots, the scattered remains of vegetables pressed into service as weapons. The weeds still stood tall and defiant, but so did the stories. Midday in the village arrived not with a grand pronouncement or fanfare, but in the rumbling of stomachs, grumbling stomachs, growling stomachs, small stomachs that echoed like caverns when poked. It arrived in the way a man wiped sweat from his brow and squinted at the sun, desperately hoping it was late enough to justify chewing on something, anything, even if it tasted suspiciously of bark. Lunch, as a concept, was more a hope than a meticulously planned affair. Some families prepared for it with an almost religious fervor, while others stumbled into it like an unexpected trap. Many, especially the children, simply accepted that lunch would be whatever you could catch, steal, find, or devour quickly enough to avoid questions. In the bakery, the meager remains of the morning's bread were crusty, hard, and faintly warm if you held them under your armpit long enough. The baker's apprentice gnawed on a slice while pretending to sweep, the taste a blend of flour, smoke, and quiet apology. Yes, remarkably beet-like, he nodded. This one resembles my uncle's head. Is that a compliment? No. She smiled anyway. A bird chirped in the distance, perhaps in amusement. Tom wiped his hands on his tunic, only to further stain the fabric. He tried again. I saved you a good one, he said, holding up a beet with a faint, lopsided grin carved into its skin. Looks like it's smiling. Anwin took it, examining it with mock seriousness. It does, but in a slightly evil way. Like your sister. Anwin gasped dramatically. Take that back. I won't. She tossed a clump of soil at his boot, and he feigned a dramatic fall backward into the soft earth, arms outstretched as if struck by a bolt of beet-related lightning. She laughed, a little too loudly. He lingered on the ground a beat longer than necessary. I was only joking, he said from below. I know. A pause. Do you think, he ventured carefully, that if you were a beet, just hear me out, you'd be a very fancy one? Fancy. You know, regal, the kind they only serve on feast days. Anwin sat back on her heels. And you'd be the one with the wormhole charming. A cart rattled by on the nearby road, unnoticed by either of them. She plucked a leaf from a nearby plant and twirled it between her fingers. My mother says I shouldn't talk to boys in the field. My mother says I shouldn't talk at all. And yet, here we are. Do you talk to other boys? He asked a bit too quickly. Anwin raised an eyebrow. Do you ask that of every girl who throws dirt at you? No. Just the ones who catch my eye while elbow-deep in tubers. She flushed, the blush manifesting in a slight slowing of her blink and a sudden, intense interest in the texture of the dirt. I don't talk to many boys, she admitted after a moment. Most of them don't say anything worth hearing. Tom fought to suppress a smile that threatened to scare the birds. I once wrote a poem, he offered, about turnips. Anwin's face lit up. The fences, for the most part, could wait. The mice remained ununionized, and if the sky held until supper, he'd chalk it up as another successful day. Boredom, however, was a constant foe, a thing to be endured. That boredom ended, as most disasters disguised as joy do, with a bell. A single, sharp clang reverberated from the village square just after dawn. No one had scheduled its ringing. It wasn't a feast day, no saint was being honored, and the crops certainly hadn't warranted a celebration. Yet the bell tolled, its sound echoing through the morning mist like a question no one dared answer. Then came the shouts. Festival Day! Someone cried, though no one could say who. The words spread like wildfire, igniting the village with a spark of spontaneous revelry. By the time the sun had fully cleared the trees, it was already being repeated as undeniable fact. It's Festival Day. Of course it is. Long live the festival. What are we celebrating? Doesn't matter. Pie's involved. And that was sufficient. The baker, still in his nightshirt, emerged to find 3 women hammering on his shutters. We need 20 pies, they declared. I haven't even made dough, he protested. Then make some, they retorted. Or the festival gods will be angry. He blinked. We have festival gods today? We do now. The blacksmith's apprentice began tying ribbons to a fence post, which promptly collapsed. Undeterred, he tied them to Oswald, the village goat, already known for questionable decision-making, who interpreted this as a sign of political elevation and commenced headbutting barrels with imperial zeal. By mid-morning, the square was unrecognizable. Someone had produced a fiddle, and someone else, who'd never played the flute before but claimed a strong familial connection to those who had, attempted to join in. The result was music, if one defined music broadly enough to encompass wailing cats and stepped-on ducks. The goats murmured softly, and one sneezed with such unexpected force that it startled the others, causing one to tip over a bucket with a clatter. Recite it. It's terrible. All the best ones are. He sat up, dusted off his hands, and, with the dignity of a farmer knight, cleared his throat. Oh, turnip stout and pale and round, Slash thy leaves like hats upon the ground. Slash thy flesh is firm, thy spirit true. Slash but still, I'd rather look at you. He looked at her. She blinked, then snorted, then dissolved into laughter, hiding her face in her apron. You're an idiot, she managed between giggles. You liked it. I loved it. But if you ever say it out loud again, I'll bury you in beats. Romantic. They sat there for a moment, not touching, not moving, just a shared silence thick with beat breath and awkward potential. In the distance, a goat bleated. I like goats, Tom said. Anwin tilted her head. That was smooth. I'm warming up. My father would kill you. I'm very fast. He's got a crossbow. I'm not that fast. They grinned at each other, a grin that blurred the rest of the world for a few precious seconds. Do you want to walk back together? She asked softly. Now, even if I didn't, I'd say yes. I figured. She stood, brushing soil from her skirt. He scrambled to his feet beside her, and for a moment, they stood awkwardly, shoulder to shoulder, pretending the wind was fascinating. She handed him the smiling beat. For your poem collection. He accepted it like a sacred relic. I'll treasure it. They started walking slowly together, one step apart, then half a step. He reached for her hand, then hesitated, pulling back. She noticed, didn't comment, just allowed the silence to stretch kindly between them. Behind them, the field was a haphazard mosaic of crooked rows and half-filled baskets, echoing with laughter that hadn't quite faded. Love in the beet field was clumsy, hesitant, a disaster of blushing cheeks and shared vegetables. But for Tom and Anwin, it was everything. The butcher, never one to miss an opportunity, declared he'd host a competition. Guess what's in this pie? Entry was free. Regret, however, was not. A group of children reenacted a heroic tale of Sir Turnip and the Dragon of Dirt, featuring one boy wearing a bucket and another pretending to breathe fire with the help of a rather potent chili pepper. An old woman blessed them both, though it was unclear whether she was a genuine healer or simply enjoying the spectacle. At the edge of the crowd, the priest stood, squinting in bewildered confusion. Who sanctioned this? You did, Father, someone lied. Oh, he replied. Well, let us give thanks. He raised his hands. A cheer erupted, though it had less to do with him and more to do with the goat, who had just stolen someone's hat and was wearing it with undeniable panache. Banners appeared, though no one could recall owning any. One was clearly a bedsheet, and another bore suspiciously familiar embroidery from someone's Sunday tunic. Yet, hung high and flapping in the breeze, they looked official enough to convince even the most skeptical. There was dancing, and there was tripping disguised as dancing. And then there was the Reeve, who insisted he was performing a traditional harvest jig from his youth, which could only be described as enthusiastic flailing. The crowd politely avoided eye contact while giving him a wide berth. The pies, when they finally emerged, were remarkably diverse in both content and structural integrity. One was undeniably just mashed beans inside a bread bowl. Another may have contained fish or soap. It was hard to tell. Everyone agreed to smile while chewing. The ale flowed early, perhaps too early. By noon, the blacksmith was serenading a pig, who, to its credit, seemed quite charmed. By 1 o'clock, 2 arguments had erupted over whether this was a genuine holiday or just an elaborate prank. By 2, both parties were drunk enough to agree that it simply didn't matter. At the edge of the monastery grounds, past the herb garden, behind the crumbling stone wall where weeds flourished unchecked, resided Brother Cuthbert. He technically had a cell, though he rarely occupied it, preferring the woods, the pond, or the shadowy spaces behind the chapel, where he whispered secrets to slugs, depending on the day. Cuthbert was unlike the other monks. For one, he collected owl feathers, not quills, not relics, but feathers, hundreds of them, meticulously sorted by length, hue, and what he termed their emotional aura. He tucked them into his robe sleeves, like bookmarks for unfinished thoughts. Sometimes they'd flutter out mid-conversation, sending him scrambling with the urgency of a man rescuing scripture. He also spoke to trees, not metaphorically or poetically, but literally, engaging in conversations complete with pauses, questions, and serious nods of understanding. He referred to the oak near the well as Father Ilrich and often informed the novices that the maple by the brook wept sap for sinners. "Some people hear angels," he once said. "I hear bark. Should we do this every year?" Someone shouted. "Yes," someone else replied. "Especially the pies." "No, not the pies," shouted a third, mouth still full. Children raced in circles. A man juggled 3 onions and then sneezed himself into unconsciousness. The goat climbed onto a hay cart and attempted a speech. No one understood a word, but the applause was thunderous. As the afternoon mellowed, the square transformed into a sea of napping bodies and crumpled paper crowns. The fiddler had broken 2 strings. The flute had been lost in a barrel. Someone circulated honey cakes that were mostly just honey and regrets. The priest eventually sat beside the baker, both men sharing the same jug. "What are we celebrating again?" the baker asked. "Unity," said the priest, squinting into the sun. "Or chaos. Maybe both. It's not a real holiday, is it? Are any of them?" The priest shrugged. "People remember joy. That seems worth ringing a bell over." They clinked cups. Somewhere the goat fell off the hay cart. By nightfall, torches flickered, songs stumbled, and the air grew thick with contented confusion. No one remembered who rang the bell. No one knew if it would happen again. But for one odd, inexplicable day, the village had celebrated something no one could name, and that, somehow, felt sacred. The village was asleep, or at least pretending to be. The hearths burned low. The bread had hardened. The last dog had given up barking at shadows. But out in the meadow beyond the last fence post, the one that leaned as if it had given up trying to stand straight, something was happening. It always started the same way. A whisper passed from mouth to mouth after supper, slipped between bites of stew and sips of weak ale. "They're going to the meadow tonight." No one specified who. No one needed to. The meadow, flat and moon-soaked, was where young villagers went when they had things to say that couldn't survive the daylight. Things like, "I think I love you," or "We shouldn't have done that," or "What if we just ran away and became candle merchants?" The moon tonight was full and nosy, hanging fat over the treetops as if it wanted a front row seat. Crickets chirped with a gossiping rhythm. The air smelled of grass, woods, and nerves. Marigold was the first to arrive. Her hair braided so tightly it betrayed the hours she'd spent preparing. She stood near the old oak, pretending to admire the view while carefully counting her breaths. Hidden beneath her sleeve was a wilted posy, not freshly picked, but intentionally chosen, a token, a maybe. Soon came Tom, boots muddy, shirt unusually clean, which meant something significant was afoot. He paced 3 steps to the left, then 2 to the right, then started over. The moon watched him. So did Marigold, though she remained silent. Elsewhere, behind the blackberry bushes, Elsie and Marta whispered as if plotting a heist. "He's going to ask her tonight." "No, he's not," he told Joran. "Joran lies. He was crying when he said it. Could be allergies." The 2 girls paused to watch a pair stumbling over the hilltop, their hands clasped awkwardly, as if they hadn't decided if it was romantic or a simple negotiation. Down by the riverbank, someone was singing badly. Someone else hushed them. A third person began clapping to the beat. The village night was alive with potential disasters.